The rain hadn't stopped since morning, and neither had my mother-in-law's voice. She stood in the doorway of the house I'd helped pay for, jabbing a finger toward the street like she owned every brick of it, every shingle, every square foot of driveway I'd once helped shovel snow off of during our first winter here, back when she still called me sweetheart, instead of whatever venom-laced version of my name she used now. Get out of my house, Sarah. This has always been Marcus's house, and I won't have you dragging his name through the mud over some silly disagreement. I stood there soaked from the walk up the driveway, my umbrella having given up somewhere around the mailbox, water running in cold rivulets down the back of my collar. I didn't flinch. I'd promised myself in the car, sitting in the parking lot of the law office for 20 minutes before I could make myself turn the key, that I wouldn't flinch. Not this time. I held a manila envelope against my chest like armor, the paper already softening slightly from the damp, and I looked past Diane's shoulder into the house that had swallowed 6 years of my life. Behind her, Marcus sat frozen on the living room couch, the same couch we'd picked out together at a furniture store in the early days, back when picking out couches had felt like the most romantic thing two people could do. His phone was clutched so tight in his hand that his knuckles had gone white, bloodless, like the blood had simply given up circulating to make some kind of point. He hadn't said a word since I walked in. He hadn't said a word in 3 days, actually, not since the board meeting he'd tried so hard to keep me from finding out about. 3 days of silence in a house we shared. 3 days of him sleeping in the guest room with the door locked, as if I were the danger in this equation. 3 days of Diane calling every morning at 8 sharp, her voice bright and oblivious on the phone in the kitchen, asking Marcus how that little misunderstanding at the office was shaping up, never once directing the question at me, as though I were furniture that happened to occupy space in her son's kitchen. "This isn't your house, Diane," I said quietly, and I was proud that my voice didn't shake, even though something in my chest was doing exactly that. "It's in both our names." And it stopped being just Marcus's world the moment he decided lying to me was easier than telling me the truth. Her eyes narrowed, that particular narrowing I'd come to recognize over the years, the one that preceded her sharpest cruelties, always delivered with a smile, so the wound would take longer to notice it was bleeding. "Whatever fantasy you've cooked up, I'm not the one living in a fantasy." I held up the envelope, feeling the weight of it, feeling the way the last 4 months had compressed themselves down into a few sheets of paper and a company letterhead. "You might want to sit down for this." She didn't move. Of course she didn't. Diane Whitmore had never sat down for anything in her life that she thought she could stare down instead. I thought, standing there in the doorway with rain dripping off my elbows onto the hardwood floor, she'd once scolded me for scuffing with my boots about how we'd gotten here. About the Marcus I married. The one who used to leave sticky notes on the bathroom mirror before early flights. The one who cried at his father's funeral until his shoulders shook. The one who promised me, standing right there in that same living room 5 years ago, that Whitmore Holdings would never come between us the way it had come between his parents. I thought about the night 4 months ago when I'd stayed late at the accounting firm I worked for, buried under a client audit that had nothing to do with my husband's company, and had stumbled, genuinely stumbled, not searched for, not gone looking for, across a discrepancy in a set of numbers that felt eerily, uncomfortably familiar. A vendor account. A shell company registered in Delaware with an address that traced back 3 shell layers deep to an LLC that shared its formation date with our wedding anniversary. I remember sitting at my desk at 11 at night, the office empty except for the hum of the vending machine down the hall, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath me as I understood, slowly, and then all at once, what I was looking at. I hadn't said anything right away. I want to be honest about that because honesty is the thing I've clung to through all of this, the thing Marcus seemed to have quietly abandoned somewhere along the way without ever telling me he was leaving it behind. I'd sat on it for 2 weeks, running numbers late at night after he'd gone to sleep, telling myself there had to be an explanation, telling myself I was overreacting, telling myself that surely, the man who still made me coffee every morning without being asked wasn't the same man siphoning company funds through a maze of accounts with his own signature buried at the bottom of it all. When I finally confronted him, in this very kitchen, on a Tuesday night with the dishwasher running in the background like some absurd metronome to the destruction of my marriage, he hadn't denied it. That was the part that broke something in me, more than the fraud itself. He hadn't even tried to lie. He just looked at me with those tired eyes and said, I needed it to look like the numbers were working. The board was already asking questions. I was going to fix it before anyone noticed. I asked him how. He didn't have an answer. He asked me, begged me, really, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since his father died, not to say anything. Not yet. Give him time, he said. Let him figure out a way to quietly move the money back before the annual audit. Let him protect what his father built. Let him protect us. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark beside a man I no longer fully recognized, listening to his breathing even out into sleep far faster than mine ever would again, and I thought about all the years I'd spent believing that loyalty meant silence. I thought about my own father, a small business owner who'd gone under because a business partner cooked the books and left him holding the wreckage. I thought about integrity and about what it would mean to become the kind of person who buried the truth to keep a house with someone else's name essentially engraved over the doorframe. I didn't report it out of anger. I want that understood, even if no one standing in that doorway with me that afternoon would ever believe it. I reported it because somewhere between the discrepancy and the confession, I remembered who I used to be before I became somebody's wife first and myself second. I remembered the version of me that sat through 4 years of accounting exams because I believed numbers didn't lie even when people did. So I picked up the phone. Not to hurt him. To be honest, one final time in the one place he'd stopped being honest with me. And now here I stood, drenched, staring down the woman who'd never once, in 6 years, treated me as anything more than the woman fortunate enough to be tolerated in her son's orbit, holding the paperwork that would end the fantasy she still seemed determined to defend. This is ridiculous, Diane said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier bravado, some crack of uncertainty creeping in now as she registered, perhaps for the first time, that I wasn't backing down the way I usually did, the way 6 years of careful, exhausted diplomacy had trained me to. Whatever nonsense is in that envelope, I'm sure it's exaggerated. Marcus would never. Diane. My voice was steady now, steadier than I felt. Marcus already knows what's in it. Ask him. For the first time since I'd walked through that door, she turned and actually looked at her son, really looked at him, the way you'd look at someone across a widening chasm you hadn't realized was already there. And whatever she saw on his face in that moment, the silence, the stillness, the way he wouldn't meet either of our eyes, made her reach out and grab the envelope from my hands before I could say another word. Diane didn't sit. She snatched the envelope instead, tearing it open with the kind of fury only a mother defending her golden child could produce, her fingernails, still manicured, still perfect, even in the middle of what was quickly becoming the unraveling of her family's carefully curated legacy, catching against the paper as she yanked it free. Her eyes scanned the letterhead. Whitmore Holdings, the company Marcus's father had built from a single warehouse and a handshake deal 40 years ago, the company Marcus had spent a decade running, though I'd learned over the last 4 months just how loosely that word applied. Board resolution. Removal of Marcus Whitmore as Chief Executive Officer. Effective immediately. I watched the words land on her the way I imagine a slap might, an actual physical recoil, her shoulders jerking back half an inch before she caught herself. Her hands started shaking, the paper trembling audibly in the quiet of the living room, competing only with the sound of rain against the windows and the low, steady tick of the grandfather clock Marcus's father had left behind, the one Diane dusted every single week like a shrine. This is a mistake. Her voice had climbed an octave, brittle now, cracking at the edges. This is, Marcus. Tell her this is a mistake. Marcus finally looked up. I'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it almost as much as I'd needed it, because I knew that whatever was on his face right now would be the truest thing he'd shown me in months. And I saw it then, the thing he'd been hiding for months, tucked behind his exhaustion and his short tempers and his sudden late nights at the office that I now understood had nothing to do with actual work. Not exhaustion. Guilt. Raw, unmistakable guilt, the kind that sits behind a person's eyes long after they've stopped bothering to hide it. They found the transfers, he said, barely above a whisper, his gaze dropping to the phone still clenched in his hand, as though the device itself might offer him some kind of escape hatch if he stared at it long enough.
The shell accounts.
Sarah found them too, before the board did. I begged her not to say anything. You begged me to help you cover it up, I corrected, and I heard how flat my own voice sounded, stripped of the anger I'd expected to feel and replaced instead with something closer to grief. There's a difference, Marcus. A big one. Diane's face had gone the color of old paper, that particular gray-white that comes when the blood drains out of a person all at once. Her eyes moved from the letter to her son to me and back again, as if she were trying to solve some equation that refused to balance, no matter how many times she ran the numbers. You reported your own husband? The question came out strangled, somewhere between an accusation and a genuine plea for this to not be true. I reported fraud, I said. He just happened to be married to me. And Diane. I let the pause sit there, let her feel the weight of what was coming before I said it, because some small, tired part of me wanted her to understand exactly how far this went before she had the chance to talk herself into believing it was a misunderstanding. The house, the cars, that country club membership you love flaunting to your bridge club, all of it was funded by a salary he doesn't have anymore. Whitmore Holdings isn't just cutting him loose. They're pursuing the missing $4 million. The number seemed to physically knock something loose in her. She sat down then, finally, dropping onto the arm of the sofa nearest her like her legs had simply stopped negotiating with the rest of her body. The envelope slid from her fingers and landed face up on the coffee table, the board's letterhead staring up at all three of us like an indictment none of us could look away from. $4 million, she repeated, her voice hollow now. Marcus. $4 million? He didn't answer her. He looked at the carpet instead, at some fixed point just past his own knees, and I realized in that silence that this was perhaps the first time in his adult life that his mother's expectations hadn't been enough to produce an explanation, a justification, some smooth reassurance designed to make the discomfort disappear. He had nothing. For the first time since I'd known him, Marcus Whitmore had absolutely nothing to offer. How? Diane said, and now she was looking at me, something shifting behind her eyes, some old reflex trying to reroute the blame in the only direction that had ever felt safe to her. How did you even find this? Were you going through his things? Were you spying on him? I'm an auditor, Diane, I said. I found a discrepancy in a routine review at my own firm. It led back to an account that happened to share formation dates with things I recognized. I didn't go looking for a way to destroy my marriage. I found a crime, and then I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be about it. You could have come to me, she said, and there was something almost pitiful in it now, some last grasping attempt at control. We could have handled this quietly, fixed it, kept it in the family. That's exactly what Marcus wanted too, I said. Keep it quiet, fix it before anyone noticed. Except the money wasn't going to fix itself, and every month it sat there unreported was another month I would have been complicit. I wasn't willing to become a criminal to protect your family's reputation. Something flickered across her face at that. Not quite guilt. Diane wasn't built for guilt the way the rest of us were, but something adjacent to it, a recognition maybe, of just how long she'd spent asking people to swallow uncomfortable truths for the sake of appearances. I thought of every holiday dinner where she'd steered conversation away from anything unflattering, every time she'd hushed a cousin who asked too many questions about the company's finances, every carefully constructed narrative about the Whitmore family's success that had apparently been built, at least in part, on numbers that didn't actually exist. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice thin.
Mom, don't.
Don't what? Diane snapped, some of her old fire returning now, though it seemed to be searching for a new target and finding, disturbingly, that her son might be it. Don't ask how my son managed to lose the company your father spent his whole life building. Don't ask how you let this happen. I didn't let it happen, Marcus said, his voice rising now too, cracking under a pressure that had clearly been building far longer than the 3 days he'd spent in silence. I made a mistake. One mistake, and then another, trying to cover the first one, and then it kept growing, and I didn't know how to stop it without everyone finding out I wasn't as good at this as everyone always assumed I was. You are your father's son, Diane said, though it didn't sound like the compliment it might have been intended as. It sounded, instead, like an accusation aimed at someone who wasn't in the room, someone who'd built an empire and left behind a son who couldn't sustain it, who'd cracked under the weight of an inheritance he was never quite equipped to carry. I stood there in the doorway still, dripping onto the floor, watching the two of them turn on each other in ways I'd never once seen in 6 years of holidays and dinners and forced pleasantries, and I felt something strange settle over me. Not triumph, not quite relief either. Just a quiet, exhausted clarity, the sense of a door finally closing on a version of my life I'd spent far too long trying to keep propped open. 3 months later, I sat in a small rented apartment that was entirely, unmistakably mine. No marble foyer, no manicured hedges, no mother-in-law materializing in doorways to remind me whose house it really was. Just quiet. Just the hum of a second-hand refrigerator I'd bought off a moving sale listing, and the soft creak of floorboards that belonged to no one's legacy, but my own lease agreement. The apartment wasn't much, a one-bedroom above a laundromat, the kind of place I would have turned my nose up at 5 years ago when I still believed square footage and granite countertops meant something about the life I was building. Now I found myself grateful for the smallness of it. Everything in it was mine. The mismatched plates. The second-hand couch I'd found on a resale app and hauled up 2 flights of stairs myself, refusing help from the one friend who'd offered, because some part of me needed to prove I could still lift things, still build things, still make a life out of nothing but my own 2 hands. Marcus called sometimes, from a number I no longer recognized, in a voice that had lost all its old certainty, that easy, boardroom confidence that used to fill every room he walked into, replaced now by something quieter and more hesitant, a man relearning how to speak without an audience of people whose paychecks depended on nodding along. He was renting a room from a college friend now, someone named Dave who I'd met exactly once, years ago, at a wedding where Marcus had given a toast so polished it sounded rehearsed even though he swore it wasn't. I wondered sometimes if Dave knew the full story, or if Marcus had given him some abbreviated, softened version, a company restructuring, a difficult transition, the kind of vague corporate language that let you skip over the parts that made you look small. Diane, I'd heard through the thinning threads of mutual acquaintances who still occasionally reached out, had sold her jewelry to cover legal fees neither of them had planned for. The country club membership had lapsed. The house, not the one Marcus and I had shared, but Diane's own house, the one she'd lived in since her husband's death, had a lien against it now, the bank's patience apparently as limited as everyone else's had become. I felt, when I heard this, not the satisfaction I might have expected. Just a strange, hollowed-out sadness, the kind you feel watching a building you once lived in get demolished, even knowing it had to happen, even knowing you were better off outside its walls. The investigation had taken most of those 3 months to fully unfold. There had been meetings with lawyers, mine and the company's both, long afternoons spent in conference rooms answering questions about when I first noticed the discrepancy, what steps I'd taken, whether I'd profited in any way from the information before reporting it. I hadn't. I made sure the paper trail on my end was as clean as the one I'd uncovered on Marcus's was not. My own attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya, who'd taken my case almost as a personal mission once she heard the details, told me early on that whistleblowers rarely come out of these situations without some scar tissue, some lingering suspicion clinging to them no matter how justified their actions were. She was right. There had been a period, right after the news broke internally at my firm, where colleagues looked at me differently, not unkindly exactly, but carefully, the way you look at someone who's proven capable of appending a life with a single phone call. I didn't blame them. I might have looked at someone the same way once, before I understood what it actually felt like to hold that kind of knowledge and have to decide, alone, at 11 at night with a vending machine humming down the hall, what kind of person to become. The divorce had been finalized 6 weeks ago. Faster than either of us expected, mostly because there was very little left to fight over. The house had to be sold to cover part of the restitution Marcus now owed, a fact that Diane had initially fought with everything she had, insisting through her own lawyer that the property predated the fraudulent transfers and shouldn't be touched. The courts disagreed. I remembered sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom the day that ruling came down, watching Diane's face crumple in a way I'd never seen it crumple before, all her sharp edges momentarily undone by the reality that even bricks and mortar couldn't be protected from what her son had done. I didn't feel triumphant watching it. I felt mostly tired. Tired in the particular way that comes after a long fight where you were right the whole time, and being right didn't make any of it hurt less. People ask if I regret it. Turning in the man I married. I get the question more often than I expected, from old friends who'd lost touch over the years I spent absorbed in Marcus's world, from new co-workers who'd heard some version of the story secondhand, from my own mother, who asked it gently over the phone one evening with the particular carefulness of a parent trying not to influence an answer she desperately hoped would be one thing and feared might be another. I tell them the truth. I didn't take anything from him. He built his own downfall, transaction by transaction, quarter by quarter, each small lie compounding into a larger one until the weight of it became something no one, not even his mother's fierce loyalty, could hold up any longer. All I refused to do was carry it for him. That refusal cost me a marriage, a house, a version of myself that had spent years learning how to make herself smaller and quieter in rooms where Whitmore family opinions took up all the available air. But it also gave me something back, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing until I felt its absence lift, the simple, uncomplicated relief of not having to hold my breath in my own home. I think sometimes about the woman I was 6 years ago, the one who walked into that house for the first time on Marcus's arm, nervous and eager to be liked, mistaking Diane's clipped politeness for the beginning of warmth rather than recognizing it, as I eventually would, as the outer edge of a boundary I'd spend years trying and failing to cross. I think about all the small compromises I made along the way, biting my tongue at family dinners, letting Diane's comments about my career, my clothes, my failure to produce grandchildren on any acceptable timeline slide past unchallenged, telling myself that peace was worth more than being right. I understand now that what I called peace was really just a slow, patient erosion, one I'd mistaken for stability because it was quiet, because it didn't announce itself the way conflict does. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes after an ending like mine. Not happiness, not right away. That took longer, and some days it still hasn't fully arrived. Some evenings I still catch myself reaching for a phone to share some small piece of news with a man who no longer occupies that place in my life. But clarity, yes. The recognition that loyalty without honesty isn't really loyalty at all, just a more comfortable name for fear. Marcus feared what the truth would cost him so much that he was willing to let me become complicit in hiding it. Diane feared what the truth would say about her family so much that she was willing to blame me for simply being the messenger. And I understand now that fear, dressed up in enough tradition and enough insistence, can look almost exactly like love, right up until the moment it's tested. I started a new position last month, a step up from where I was before, ironically enough, my firm's leadership. Once the dust settled, and the investigation into Whitmore Holdings concluded with the board publicly thanking the anonymous internal source who'd flagged the discrepancy, seemed to look at me with a kind of quiet respect I hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure I deserved. I don't know if they ever pieced together that the anonymous source and the woman going through a quiet, unremarkable divorce were the same person. I never told them. Some things I've learned don't need to be advertised to be true. Marcus's calls have grown less frequent. The last one about 2 weeks ago was different from the others. No explanations, no attempts to rewrite the narrative into something more forgivable. He just asked how I was doing. I told him the truth, that I was doing better than I expected to be. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I hadn't expected. "You were always the only honest person in that house." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and eventually he said goodbye, and I haven't heard from him since. I don't know if I will again. I've made a kind of peace with not knowing. The rain outside my window had finally stopped, that same rain that had soaked me through on the day I stood in Diane's doorway with an envelope that changed everything. For the first time in years, so had the noise in my head, the constant low hum of calculation and self-editing that comes from living inside someone else's expectations, the endless internal negotiation over which parts of myself were safe to bring into a room and which needed to be left folded up and put away. I made myself a cup of tea in a mug that didn't match any of my other mugs, and I sat by the window of my small apartment, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one as the evening settled in, and I let myself feel, for just a moment, something like pride. Not for what had happened to Marcus, or to Diane, or to the company that bore his father's name, but for the version of myself who'd sat at that desk at 11 o'clock at night 4 months ago, staring at numbers that didn't add up, and had chosen, against every instinct toward comfort and quiet and the easy path of looking away, to tell the truth anyway. Some people build their lives on inheritance, on legacy, on the comfortable fiction that blood and money and old family names can protect you from consequence indefinitely. I'd spent 6 years trying to earn a place inside that fiction, only to discover, in the end, that the version of me who walked away from it, soaked, exhausted, and entirely, finally honest, was the only version worth keeping.